Where are you calling from?
I'm in Washington, D.C. Okay, I think we can start. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our webinar on a book talk, actually, this time on Superpower Showdown, how the battle between Trump and Xi threatens a new Cold War, written by Bob Davis and Lingling. Thank you for joining us, and I will just give a short bios of our authors and then start asking my questions. In the meantime, you can write your questions. If you are following on Zoom, you can write on the chat box or Q&A. And if you are following on social media, you can write a comment on YouTube, Twitter, or Facebook. My assistants will collect those questions and convey it to me. And we are trying to make it as interactive as possible. Just to give a short bios of these two very prominent experts on China-US relations. Bob Davis is a Pulitzer Prize-winning senior editor at the Wall Street Journal's Washington, D.C. bureau. He covers economic issues and continues to write about China, where he was posted from 2011 to 2014. Bob has served at the journal's bureau chief in Brussels, covering the European Union, and as the Latin America bureau chief, he lives in Washington, D.C. And Lingling is an award-winning journalist in the Wall Street Journal's Beijing bureau. Hailing from a far province in southeastern China, she came of age as journalist in New York and then returned to China in early 2011 to report on changes in her homeland. She focuses on the intersection of Chinese politics and economy. And as far as I know, she was expelled from China in March, right? March of this year, with other journalists from New York Times and Post. Thank you for joining us. And I read your book, and I will have some questions. And let me start with a general question. On my table right now, when I was looking last night at the books written on China-US rivalry, I have at least 20 books. There are books focusing on that China has already won this war. There are new books saying that has China won the war. There are books who says that US will win this war. And there are those who, still thinks about what could happen in the next 30 years of this rivalry. So what is so different about your book when this probably being an academic, we constantly being asked by our advisors or our readers about what is so different, what is original about your book. Let's start with that. Bob, shall we start with you?
Sure. There are a lot of books on US-China, certainly. One of the reasons is it's really hard to know what's going to happen. But I think what distinguishes our book is that it is a book of reporting. Mm-hmm. I mean, it is a deeply reported book that goes back, into the Clinton Zhu era, which is kind of 25 years ago, into the last couple of years. And we report this from both capitals. I work in Washington for a long time. Lingling works in Beijing, or had until very recently worked in Beijing. And particularly for the last couple of years during the Trump and Xi Jinping encounter, we really, I think, distinguished ourselves and distinguished Superpower Showdown by reporting simultaneously in both capitals. Lingling would get a tip, in Beijing. She'd pass it over to me in Washington, and I would run it by, officials in Washington. And it gave us a much broader perspective, and also, frankly, I think kept officials in both capitals more honest, because they knew, people in China knew that we were talking to people in Washington and vice versa. So for me, it's the old cliche about the first draft of history, but that's really what I think it is. I think when people look back at this era, I really hope that they'll, consult our book to get an idea of what actually happened at the time.
Lingling?
I couldn't have said better than what Bob just did. Just in short, we're offering a kind of perspective few other people have. Is a perspective from deep reporting from both capitals, Washington and Beijing.
One more question. Your book actually is stops in phase one, actually, the trade deal. And after that, things fall apart a little more with the COVID-19 crisis. So if you were writing this book, let's say in June or July, what would you add to this book as part of Superpower Showdown?
Well, I mean, we did get a little bit into COVID in the book in the final edits, but not much. I mean, truly not much, because the book really does end, January, February of this year, and the crisis was really just beginning at that point. I mean, what we would add is all the back and forth and nastiness about who was responsible for COVID, how was it handled. The trends that we talk about in terms of, disunity, disengagement, derailment to the relations have only gotten worse. I mean, COVID has just magnified everything.
Mm-hmm. Ling, do you want to add something about that?
Sure. In addition to COVID, as Bob just described, we probably also would have added more about how geopolitical issues, such as those involving Hong Kong, really are playing into China's, decision-making process, involving how to deal with the U.S. Why exactly, what are the other motivations Chinese leadership might have had when they cut a deal, this phase one trade deal with Washington, whether or not, Beijing's plan to impose a national security law on Hong Kong played a role or not in that decision.
And one more question about this. Since the COVID-19 crisis started, there has been debate in Washington, D.C. at least about decoupling. And in your book, actually, you mentioned that decoupling efforts started in China earlier with ZTE semiconductors, like the decision of United States. So how successful has been decoupling of China, especially in regards to high-tech technology and semiconductor business? And how you see the trajectory of decoupling debates in the United States in regards to, at least right now, on medical equipment, but in the long run, some other critical technologies as well. Ling, shall we start with you this time?
Oh, sure. In terms of how successful China has been, you're right to point it out that, despite the fact that it's a U.S. administration that, kept talking about decoupling either in the technology area or financial area, China actually has already done that. They have taken actions. Maybe the earliest example would be the Great Firewall, right? China has managed to basically wall off the internet within China from the rest of the world. The censorship, people only allowed to see what the government deems appropriate. So in terms of the latest efforts, I mean, it's still work in progress. It's much easier said than done. It's not like, they can win Chinese companies and government agencies off of American technology overnight. The fact that, for example, the Trump administration's sanctions against key Chinese companies like Huawei definitely would make it harder for China to realize is technological ambitions to, basically, create their own national champions. So it's still work in progress in China. In some areas, especially like areas like semiconductor, aerospace, China still is lagging.
Bob?
Well, I mean, in terms of the debate in Washington, I mean, yeah, you hear about it all the time, right? That the U.S. is too dependent on China on medical devices and pharmaceuticals. And it's probably true. It is too dependent on any one country. I mean, the pandemic shows the importance of having a domestic capability as well. But I think it's also interesting. I mean, they've been talking about this for months, and I don't really see any evidence of anything particularly happening. So it's easier to talk about, but the supply chains are so globalized that it's not really that easy to just snap your fingers and expect, the supply chain to move back. I mean, there'll have to be very important incentives offered to industry, either that or orders. And I'm not sure an order would actually work really well, but it's important incentives to get companies to relocate and bring back equipment making and drug making to the US, let alone other sorts of, semiconductors, you name it. I mean, it can be anything from clothes to computer chips, right? I mean, there are a lot of reasons that companies moved out of the US, moved manufacturing out of the US, and very few of those conditions have changed. The only thing that's changed is some sort of expanded sense of what's national security.
Mm-hmm. And going back to your book, actually, on the history of for the last 3 decades, economic relations of two countries. And we have heard a lot about something that you also stated in your book, that United States has misread China's rise. So far, the United States more conservative foreign policy circles argue that it was a serious mistake. United States misread China's rise. What was the mistake here? How did they make this mistake? President Trump kept talking about this a lot. It goes back all the way to Clinton administration and even before that. What made United States to misread a country, not only, for a certain period of time, but for almost 3 decades?
Well, there's an argument that they misread it for 3 decades. I mean, the argument is that during the Clinton administration, and you got to put yourself back in that period, right? We're talking about the, early to late 1990s. The Soviet Union had just collapsed. Mm-hmm. Eastern Europe had just collapsed. Latin America had moved from dictatorship to democracy. South Korea had done the same. Taiwan had done the same. It wasn't much of a stretch to imagine that China was going to follow the same path. I mean, the same sort of arguments, rising middle class would lead to greater pressure on a government to deliver. I mean, you look at the Tiananmen Square killings, if those soldiers hadn't fired their weapons as their, commanders told them, the Chinese regime would have fallen. That would have been the end of China, the communist rule of China. So the idea that economic engagement would lead to political liberalization and to economic changes that made China is never going to be the US, I mean, economically, but, more or less along those kind of lines, along capitalist lines, didn't really seem to be that much of a stretch. It was not something that only, liberals or people invested in China thought. It was across the board. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, clearly a mistake was that economic liberalization in the Chinese context meant that would move inevitably to a political liberalization. I mean, that happened in the Soviet Union before it fell apart under Gorbachev, but it clearly did not happen under China. The other issue is, what about economic liberalization? America was the model, you would say, one of the big models for China as it's expanding economically. But China's internal model, domestic model, was much more sturdy than Americans gave it credit for. And so the changes that were expected just in the economic realm many of them, some of them came about. I mean, there's a certain amount of revisionism going on here. Some of them came about, but clearly China is not a similar country economically to the West.
Lingling, in most of the discussions about the change, the misreading of China, there are some arguments which says that U.S. side underestimated the centralization of power in China, especially in the state structure, or they misread the concerns in China in regards to the end of the Soviet Union and how the glasnost and perestroika and kind of, like the destroyed Soviet Union, the lessons from the end of the Cold War. Do you think there were any other factors that led to some kind of cautious opening or liberalization in China?
You mean any factors that
Yes.
could lead to that kind of, one point that we really tried to make in this book was, in the past, for many, many years, foreign pressure, especially pressure from the United States, was good for reforms, kind of market changes. The best example was during China's negotiation for the entry into WTO. Back then, the whole desire to get into WTO and the pressure from the US was a big reason, why China, promised and actually carried out some of the very painful reforms involving SOEs. But no longer that is the case. Foreign pressure is no longer good for reforms in China. That's one of the key points we wanted to make, because obviously it's a different Chinese leader in power who has consolidated so much power into his own hands, and in a sense, President Xi Jinping really is the most forceful, powerful, ideologically driven, and least pragmatic Chinese leader you have seen in recent history, that really has explained why the resolve to hit back against the US for any kind of sanctions the US is initiating against China, it's so strong. Like, we are seeing it basically happening throughout 2 years of trade negotiations, and we're still seeing it today. Like, in every arena, if the US does something, China inevitably hit back. And the momentum, what's a big consequence? One of the biggest consequences is right now there's no momentum for any kind of real reform. So you ask a great question. What would make China to really to change and carry out some of the reforms that actually ultimately would be good for China's economy in the long run? I think at this point, the pressure has to come from within, as opposed to from outside of China.
There is a question from our audience. I start to bring the questions as well while asking my own questions. Anas asks, if in light of your argument that the US has misread China for so long, do you anticipate a change in approach to policy towards China should Joe Biden become president? Or will it simply be business as usual regardless of whatever change occurs?
Well, a couple of things on that. I think, no, it would certainly change. The tone would without a doubt change from the sort of hostility and, confrontation and kind of ragging on China. That's these people won't talk in that same fashion. But some things I think you would see essentially a continuation. I think on military exercise in the South China Sea, I think actually the Trump administration built on what Obama did, and Biden administration would build on what Trump did. There is a growing concern in the U.S. national security circles that China's needs to be confronted and pushed back when it comes to the South China Sea. So that part I think would be the same. On the economic, which is I think actually a harder issue in terms of figuring them out. I think both of us think that the underlying issues of disengagement and so on would continue. It's not policy driven, basically. You have two countries moving in very different directions. But I think and also remember, so if Biden wins, he then inherits tariffs on 3/4 of everything China sells to the US. And he'd want something to roll back any of those tariffs. It's not clear what China would give. So you have that. And also, I think a difference would be that a Biden administration would try to act more multilaterally, put pressure on China in a more multilateral fashion, but also reach out to China. It would need to reach out to China for a number of its top priorities, which would be rejoining the Paris Accord and revitalizing it, rejoining the Iran deal. I mean, those things China plays an enormous role on. And presumably, I mean, I don't know, but I mean, an obvious candidate would be working together on health issues. That this pandemic's not going to be gone by January 20th.
Lingling?
Yeah, obviously, if you ask the Chinese officials, which presidential candidate you would wish to win, some of them might tell you that China might be hoping for a new beginning for precisely the reasons Bob just laid out. A Biden administration might go back to some of those multilateral organizations seeking to cooperate with China on issues like healthcare and environmental and other areas. Both sides do share a lot of common concerns. So because right now it does seem like nothing. Both governments are cooperating very, very little. Bob and I frequently, told people that it's kind of ironic in a way that this whole relationship started to crumble in the area of trade. And now this is the only one area where both sides remain in frequent communications with each other. So it just shows, how much things have changed, and this whole relationship is just hanging by such a thin thread right now.
Bob, Ling just mentioned the significance of trade and as a bond between two countries, despite the concept of the trade war. I remember almost a decade ago, Rand Corporation wrote this report and come up with a concept of mutually assured economic destruction. And it was the mutually assured destruction of the Cold War. It was revised within the China-US relation. Do you think that trade relations are so strong that would stabilize or prevent a conflict between US and China? And within this context, I want you to mention this, tell us a little bit about this CEO summit that you talk about in your book, that there was a survey among the CEOs, and in the first question, almost 50% of that argued that they expect a war between US and China. Later, it came down to 1/3, according to your book. But isn't this a really big number, that expects a war, an actual war between US and China, two nuclear powers, two major trade partners?
Yeah, let me talk about the second part first. Yeah, I think it was stunning. I mean, the Wall Street Journal hosts a chief executive officer summit a couple times a year before the pandemic. Anyway, they would meet in Washington. They'd meet in some other city around the world to talk. You pay a lot of money to be part of this. It's like $25,000 to be part of this very elite club. And then they bring in lots of high-level officials from various governments. This particular one was John Bolton, then the National Security Advisor, was talking incredibly loosely about, pressuring China, even, talking about the prospects of an actual shooting war. And then the question was posed to the audience: do you think, I think it was in the next 20 years, do you think that the two countries will engage in a war? An actual war, not a trade war. And half of them said yes, and it fell to a third. And it just blew me away. I mean, I was in the audience. It just blew me away. I've been a Washington reporter for a long time. I covered the China's accession to the WTO and all the maneuvering in Washington and Beijing that happened. And the idea that, and at that time, CEOs they were just the lobbyists for Beijing, the best lobbyists by far. And the idea that a group of CEOs, half or a third of a group of CEOs, thought these two countries were going to go to a war. I mean, it's just remarkable. I mean, just remarkable. I mean, you know, I'd be surprised. I mean, if you had a similar group during the midst of the actual Cold War, and they would have thought that half would, you know, the US would be at war with the Soviet Union. I mean, it's just, you know, it's kind of end of the world sorts of thing. So yeah, I think it was stunning. That was one of the things that motivated the way we looked at the book. I mean, in terms of whether trade will be enough to head that off, no, never. I mean, first of all, the trade relations aren't strong. They're just strong compared, as Lingling was saying, they're strong compared to everything else, which is going to hell in a handbasket. But I mean, I think history shows that trade is insufficient to head off war. I mean, the most famous example was Europe before World War I, where the countries traded enormously among each other and still went to an unbelievably bloody, debilitating war. So no, sadly, I don't think economics guarantees us, you know, a pass on actual war.
Ling, if this survey was conducted among the CEOs of the Chinese companies in Beijing, what would be the response, you know, like for an expectation of an actual war with United States?
Wow, that requires some imagination on my part. Well, you know, probably, I think the Chinese business sector, I mean, it depends on its SOE CEOs or private sector CEOs, I guess. I mean, the prevalent feeling in China right now also is, you know, more hawkish, you know, this kind of hardline sentiment in China definitely is growing as well. You actually, you know, if you look at official remarks, you know, by different kinds of officials, the tone also become very belligerent. One of the latest examples, you know, that really struck me is, you know, a senior official at China's Central Party School wrote something, and just, you know, it was right after this, you know, military confrontations China had with Indian troops, you know, on the China-Indian borders. You know, there was very little coverage within China about that that clash, but obviously people still wrote about it. And this party school official said something like, you know, if you know, don't take this incident, you know, too seriously. You know, if China really has an enemy, the enemy wouldn't be India, it would be the United States. So you do see that kind of more belligerent, hawkish talks popping up more often these days than it used to be. So directly confirms, you know, what Bob just said about the sentiment in Washington.
Mm-hmm. Bob, I just want to go back to the book, and there is a quote about the potential future of the relations, and you and Ling stated, combination of alliance building backed by the threat of unilateral action could be a way for a second term of Trump presidency or democratic alternative. And which means that, are you talking about something, you know, like a balance between Obama term policy towards China and Trump's first term? Because Obama was the person who focused more on multilateralism in regards to dealing with China, especially in trade issues, negotiating TPP and other things, among the other things. And we see a very unilateralist president with Donald Trump. So for the next 4 years, at least, do you expect a combination of that too? Or do you hope that it will be a combination of Obama and Trump first term?
So that was part of the book where we made a few policy recommendations, a few suggestions about a way forward. We weren't suggesting that was a forecast. So, I mean, in a second Trump term, do I think he'll turn to multilateralism? No, I see no evidence of that at all. I think you'd see a continuation of what you have now, except in a sort of surprising way on security issues, right? I mean, I think many of the United States allies are also becoming increasingly wary of China militarily. And so I think you could see a multilateral effort on the military part, or even on the technology part when it comes to Huawei and questions of the future of the internet, that sort of thing. But I think if it's a Biden administration, I think you would, I mean, their intention, put it that way, their intention is to act more multilaterally. One possible way to do this, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, as you noted, a deal between a dozen countries in the Asia Pacific. They concluded a deal. They gave it an even harder to remember name. And I mean, one and Biden talked in the primaries of trying to renegotiate that deal to make it a little more favorable to the US so they could join. That would be a way forward. I mean, he hasn't talked about it since. I mean, I think the funny thing is if he continues to have a big lead like this, to the election, I doubt he'll be very specific on anything to do with China. I mean, I think why give, I think the feeling would be why give Trump, anything to shoot at. So I wouldn't, in terms of a policy coming out, I think that largely depends on how he's doing in the polls. But I think a possible way forward for him, if he wants it, is to try to get to become part of the TPP. And this is the Obama strategy: become part of the TPP, make the Trans-Pacific Partnership broader, include more countries in Asia, add countries in Europe. Then you have a trade bloc of maybe 2/3 of the global economy, and then you have better leverage with China, and maybe China would want to join or accept some of the conditions and some of the terms that that the countries agreed to in the TPP. It's sort of like the WTO strategy, very similar kind of updated view.
Ling, and what is the expectation in Beijing about the U.S. election? What do they expect from a second-term Trump presidency or a Democratic alternative?
Depending who you ask, I guess some people still view, Trump is a gift to China because the kind of, damage it has done to U.S. status on the world stage, right? The U.S. so far has left so many multilateral organizations, and some people have argued it's no longer the kind of world leader it has been for a long time. So that creates opening for China to be more assertive, act really like a superpower. But as I also said before, there's also a lot of frustration on Chinese part, dealing with a very unpredictable Trump administration that is basically hitting at China from every angle right now. So it's totally a huge pain for them to have to deal with. But on the other hand, there's a saying in China: no crisis should ever go to waste. So this kind of difficulty on the diplomatic front has really helped to rally support for the party leadership. And that's for the party is probably more important than anything else.
Bob, Ling mentioned the U.S. standing, and I want to go back to the book and talk a little bit about public perception of China in the U.S. And you mentioned the Pew 2019, that there is a 60% unfavorable view. And after I read your book, I was checking if there is any update on Pew Research about this. They published a new report on April 2020, a year after that, and the unfavorability rating rose to 66%. Part of that can be COVID, but we see, you know, like when I look at the trajectory and statistics, I see that at least since 2014, 2015, there is a constant increase in the rise at the unfavorability rating of China in the US. Do you think this would add something to the policy in the US? Do you think it will influence the policymakers' perception of the US, or would create an extra pressure on Washington in regards to its policy towards China?
Well, I think it gives policymakers a reason, kind of a free pass, basically, to pursue a tougher policy toward China, without a doubt, right? I mean, I'm not sure that Americans, you know, think about China. A lot of Americans think about China all that much, but I mean, to the degree they do think about it, it's not positive remotely, and it had been reasonably positive, you know, before that. I mean, it's also, again, you know, you see these polls, they ask a question, you know, for if you're a, I don't know, if you're a factory worker in, you know, in the Southeast, are you think about China and, you know, unhappy about China? Yeah, definitely. Or if you're a farmer maybe, and you think that, you know, China's ripping off, you know, your genetic, your seeds and so on, do you think about China? Sure. But I think kind of the person on the streets, I mean, if asked, they'll give an answer, right? But I don't think it's, you know, necessarily front of their mind. I think that's a difference. I mean, Lingling can tell me if she agrees or disagree, but I think people in China think about the U.S. way more. Average, ordinary people in China think about what the U.S. thinks of China way more than Americans think about what does China think. You know, what's the role of China in anything? It's just the way the U.S. is. But still, I mean, there is a broad bipartisan agreement at this point that China is a rising threat and needs to be confronted. So, I mean, you see that in the Congress. I mean, Congress is pushing the administration. You don't have to push this administration very hard on China, but gives support to the administration's hardline views, and would be, if, let's say, for the sake of argument, if Biden came in looking to take a softer line, I'm not saying that he would, but if he did, he would face a considerable difficulty with Congress, because Congress is definitely moving in a much more hawkish way toward China.
Ling, I want to go back and ask the other part, the US perception in China. We know that in 1990s, there was this a little bit state-sponsored, actually, anti-Westernism that erupted actually in some critical moments. EP-3 plane incident, in the bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, and in some other instances, even when China couldn't get 2000 Olympics in, I think it was 1992. So is there any change in the attitude? Is it much more social anti-Westernism or anti-Americanism right now, or is it still sponsored by the government?
That's a great question. I do think that there is a significant uptick in anti-American sentiment and anti-foreign Western sentiment overall among Chinese public these days. Really, the COVID pandemic really exacerbated that kind of feelings, because you know, many Chinese, they really feel that yes, China was the first country that got hit by this pandemic, but it was also the first one that's coming out of it. But for some of the recent cases, they're like experiencing second wave or third wave of cases in some selected cities, and you know, the official media reports always say, oh, those were imported cases, meaning people traveling into China from overseas. But what they left out was those imported cases were imported by Chinese nationals, right? They had been overseas and then they came back, brought those virus back. So, but those reports really didn't help, you know, on the contrary, it stirred up more this kind of xenophobia. In terms of the government, and you know, the party leadership always kind of taken advantage of certain events, they would activate the button, on this kind of anti-American propaganda whenever it suits its purposes, right? So, but increasingly, they also do have to take into account the overall sentiment among the Chinese public. In the past, for a long time, this view, I do feel like the Chinese always had a love-hate relationship with the Americans. On one hand, as Bob mentioned earlier, the U.S. definitely for a long time was economic model for China to emulate. Various technology, superpower as well. So there are many things that Chinese people wanted to just be like Americans, but also this ideological clash has always been there. But it's being basically accelerated under President Xi Jinping.
And you mentioned earlier the clashes in the India-China border. And if those clashes was with American forces, would be probably the public's perception and the reaction would be much different, right?
Oh my gosh, that's unimaginable if such a thing were to happen or had occurred. So I just, I don't want to speculate on that. I just really still hope leadership in both countries maintain the cool head. Not to go to such extremes.
Bob, there are a lot of questions about geopolitics. So although everybody was somehow optimistic that geoeconomics will prevail and it would create an integrative force among the countries, stabilize the relations with major powers, there is now a lot about geopolitics. You mentioned a little bit securitization of China policy in the US as well. One of the questions, and most of the questions that I receive is about balancing China. And one of those questions states, what is the possible role of Russia and or India in US-China balance of power moving forward? Could Japan emerge a possible asset to balance China?
From the Washington perspective. So we're talking here from the Washington perspective. I think you see pretty clearly that the Trump administration has tried to recruit India. Japan has been, at the forefront, raising its hand to get involved, under the U.S. umbrella. They don't talk about East Asia anymore. They talk about the Indo-Pacific, whatever that is. It's a rebranding, but it's a rebranding to get India, as a counterweight to China. From the Washington perspective, getting Russia involved, no, that's, not under this administration. I suppose, we can talk about this from Beijing's perspective, maybe, it turns to Russia to try to balance the US. We are, increasingly in a, two-power kind of world, right? Russia's still clearly a military superpower, but that is all that it is. China is, still not, the equal of the U.S. economically or militarily, but clearly is the rising power. So it is getting to be, the reemergence in a different way of the great game, right? Of, the sort of different, major powers in the world trying to create alliances and, coalitions against the other.
Ling, from Beijing perspective, we don't hear a lot about containment, but we hear the word encirclement a lot. That especially the Western analysts saying that Beijing is feeling encircled by United States after each and every this diplomatic meeting between US and India, Japan, or even like Philippines at some point in regards to South China Sea. What is the perspective in Beijing about this encirclement? And do you think the One Belt, One Road can be a way that Beijing, the authorities in Beijing think to break this encirclement, if they feel so?
Well, that's really very complicated issue for China because, obviously when China's relationship with the U.S. Weakens, it inevitably would seek other allies, or just play off U.S. traditional allies against the U.S. I mean, that dynamic really played out throughout the trade war. China, during the past 2 years until very recently, China actually got closer to Japan, to EU. Just early this year, there were hopes for a bilateral investment treaty between Beijing and Europe. But obviously, that didn't happen, partly because of COVID, and also partly because a more challenging issue for China these days really is, what they have done in Hong Kong. That sort of like, this national security law in Hong Kong really has galvanized support for more democratic values being championed by the U.S. You saw Britain joining the U.S. in terms of sanctioning Huawei. It's really the challenges from the diplomatic front for China definitely are growing by the day. In terms of Belt and Road, that really is signature Xi Jinping program aimed at promoting China's influence, overall in the world stage. It has encountered a lot of problems, the backlash, right, from countries that received Chinese loans. China refused to restructure the loans, insisted on taking ownership on critical infrastructure projects. And that backlash had occurred even before recent tensions popping up. So, but I don't think they will back off from that initiative, but they may make some tweaks to the program to, try to basically make it more appealing. But the overall direction, I'm not really seeing them abandoning or dropping the program at all.
Thank you. Bob, another geopolitics question. Do you see China becoming a more active player in global politics on the back of the trade conflict with the US? For example, would it use its economic leverage to influence issues in the Middle East on an overt political and possibly even military manner? If so, do you see China being part of the Russia bloc, or would it adopt a third wave position and draw its own global strategy?
Well, you asked it to me, but I think it's better directed at Lingling. I mean, I'll just give a cursory answer. I mean, it's funny that the questioner asked, would China become part of the Russia bloc? I mean, I think it's the question, does Russia become part of the China bloc, right? I mean, Russia, again, is a military power, but a fading economic power, not much of an economic power to start with, and fading over time with no particular ideological pull. China has, an ideological argument, about how to develop economically. Clearly it was successful, at least for China anyway. So it's an ideological opponent to the US as well as a military one. But I'll defer to Lingling on the China questions.
Ling?
Sure. I mean, and as I mentioned before, I do believe that the Chinese government under Xi Jinping is becoming increasingly ideologically driven. And, when we were writing about the book, the subtitle is, A New Cold War. Obviously, a lot of people thought there was not a suitable a way to describe the confrontations we're seeing right now between the two world powers, because after all, very different from the first Cold War between the US and China. But really, there are so many similarities in terms of the key issues, right? You do see two distinctly two very increasingly distinct ideological blocks emerging. One is centered by the values championed by the U.S., democratic values, and the other, is China. For example, the very recent national security law move on Hong Kong, there's basically all those nations in UN kind of voted, let their opinions know in terms of which way they stand on China's move on Hong Kong. China got more votes than the no votes. It's also very divided by the ideological lines.
Thank you. We have less than 10 minutes, and I have like 6-7 questions, but I will ask 2 of them. One is Bob, in regards to human rights issues, and it is a complicated question, but it includes how effective would be American pressure on China regarding human rights issues. And there is another question that is tied to that, actually, how business interest and Chinese lobby in Washington, D.C. can influence U.S. attitude towards human rights in China, in particular the Uyghur issue.
So the U.S. has put pressure on China over human rights pretty much at least since the Tiananmen killings. I'm trying to think if it was before that also. But I mean, at least since then, right? And it seemed to have some sway, I mean, at least until Xi Jinping came to power. I mean, clearly, there was the retrenchment after Tiananmen Square, but let's say from China getting into the WTO, again, I mean, Lingling would be, better positioned to answer this question, but I think at least at the beginning of Xi Jinping, I think there was some liberalization, political liberalization. I think Chinese people feel they have more freedoms than their parents did. But I mean, clearly things have reversed under Xi Jinping. Will the US be successful in pressuring China over human rights? Maybe at the margins. But even if it isn't successful, I mean, the question is, should it do it? Does the U.S. stand for anything? Do the values the U.S. holds dear, are they some things that the U.S. should champion, even if it looks pretty bleak at the moment that other countries, would adopt them? So I think, they will keep trying. In terms of the China lobby pressuring the U.S. government, well, what's the China lobby? The China lobby is essentially big business, right? They're the only ones that have been effective. I don't see at this point big business lining up. I'm just thinking this out loud because it's a question I haven't thought about. Big business lining up, taking a hard line or trying to take a hard line with this administration or a Biden administration to ease up on Hong Kong or to ease up on Xinjiang and the Uyghurs. I think that's kind of a losing argument. I mean, they're sort of caught in the middle, right? I mean, if they act too independently and too critically of China, China will, this has shown time after time after time, crack down on those companies by essentially threatening to withdraw their ability to operate in the Chinese market. But also for them to pressure the U.S. government, I'm just, again, thinking this out loud, for them to have any success in pressuring the U.S. government on human rights to ease off, boy, I don't think so. I mean, it's a little different than it was under Clinton. During the Clinton years, the big business definitely did get Clinton to back off on human rights, but it's just a different time. I mean, China was seen as, just a golden opportunity. It's seen as less of a golden opportunity now. There was, real divisions, within the business community and within the Clinton administration about how best to encourage, economic, political liberalization in China. There was a really belief that economic engagement would help. I don't think there is that belief anymore. So no, I think you'll see more pressure, and I doubt you'd see the U.S. business interests lobbying for, the administration to back off, unless unless, I know I'm going on here, but unless, let's say for the sake of argument, the US were to put sanctions on Chinese banks so they couldn't use the dollar. If the US started treating China like it treats Iran, yeah, I think you'd see a big reaction, but I don't think that's going to happen.
Ling?
Yeah, I would just add one thought to what Bob just said. I don't feel like the US has a lot of options these days to really press China hard on human rights, because I should rephrase it. I don't think the US has a lot of options to do this without really hurting its interests along the way. Because, for example, what Bob just mentioned about cutting China off of the dollar system, right? I mean, yeah, sure, it would be huge, gigantic blow to the Chinese economy and all that, but it also will hurt the US interests as well. So many US businesses spend a quarter century building up supply chains in China. It's just the interests these days are so intertwined, right? Like in terms of the issues involving Hong Kong, yes, the US has, basically laid out things they would do, and they have already stripped Hong Kong off of this a preferential status. But what to happen next? The options really aren't so many that wouldn't require a big hit to US interests as well. So I think that's probably feeds into the Chinese calculations as well. Like, yeah, you can rhetorically, you can really talk tough, but when it comes to reality, you probably would also have to think twice before you take any drastic measures.
And the last question, Bob. There has been some optimism, at least from the statements of the US officials, in regards to phase one of the trade deal. And how do you see this phase one? And do you think probably it would be after the November elections? Do you think there will be any phase two that would, that would prove that phase one is successful?
On phase two, I don't see any prospects for phase two, because I don't think that China is interested in the phase two, given that the issues that would be under discussion would cut and to the centrality of the way it operates its economy. I think look at it from Trump's political perspective, right? I mean, I don't think it's very unlikely China is going to hit the purchasing targets under phase one, which is frankly all Trump cares about. But probably the purchases will be increasing. So he would have a reason to argue that, I got this deal, or orders, manufacturers are getting more orders. So that's a plus. So I don't see that he would want to blow it up. And I don't see that China would want to blow it up by, say, not coming sort of close, reasonably close, to the targets that were in the deal. So I think that it's sort of solid. I mean, sort of is because it's all political, right? I mean, if it's, if we come into October 1st and Trump is down 10 points, maybe he'll blow up the deal because, that he sees that in his political advantage. So you can never say never, particularly in a political season.
Ling?
I agree with Bob. There's no phase two in near future. We'll be lucky if phase one holds.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Ling. And thanks for the audience. It was a great panel, and it is a great book. Thanks for writing it. I really enjoyed it. And I hope to see everyone in our next webinar next week on Qatar, in another book on Qatar and its policy in Middle East. Thank you very much.
Thank you.